5 years down the line, I don't know what I'll be doing. I may be dead, I may not be. If you asked me when I was 17 what I'd be doing with my life, I would have said, oh, I'd definitely be a writer. But found medicine was, in fact, the perfect place. I first began noticing symptoms in my 6th year of residency. Obviously, Lucy and I were both very suspicious that I had some form of cancer, but actually having the confirmation was still devastating. Since Katie's birth, my time with her has had a very peculiar and free nature. In all probability, I won't live long enough for her to remember me, and so the time just is what it is. It's a careful balance. If you don't think about the bad case, that ending is going to be very rough on you and your family. But if you don't think about the good case, you're going to miss an opportunity to really make the most out of your life and time.
Paul's critically acclaimed memoir, When Breath Becomes Air, is a profound, searingly honest, and ultimately life-affirming meditation on the challenge of facing death and the relationship between doctor and patient. It's been a New York Times bestseller. It's been published into more than 40 languages. That's what I hear. What have people been telling you? I hear that they've been writing letters to you. What are the things you're hearing? How is it changing people?
It's been like the best and worst experience of our lives, obviously. And I just wanted to say thanks for inviting me. I'm really excited to be here. I've never been to Google before. Paul's best friend in the world, Robin Maroney, is a writer who works for Google, actually. And we have other friends who work here. So it's really exciting to join you. And I'm grateful for the invitation. Sort of one of the weirdest personal things about the book coming out is I remember being so excited to see the review in the New York Times. Like, first of all, just to get a review in the New York Times and then have it be a good review. You're like, thank God. And the reviewer, Janet Maslin, wrote, this is an indelible book. And it was like this sort of weird moment for me of, like, Paul died, and then he's indelible in a certain way. And so it's just this bizarre combination of connecting with people over him, like you say, and then missing him at the same time. And so, yeah, people tweet me and they write to me. And the thing that I think is the most gratifying to hear is when somebody says, this helped me through a time of suffering, to relate with Paul's words, or what you said, this deepened a relationship of mine in some way, or this made me less afraid to die, which is quite a profound thing to say. And I think that would have meant a lot to Paul as well. So that's been really exciting. And then people write to me about grief or about caregiving. A woman recently wrote to me and said, caregiving is a beatitude, grief is a beatitude. Like, there's sort of these deep, painful and moving experiences that we all share. You know, we can't avoid them. So I think just the feeling of connecting with people over suffering, it's not something any of us wants, but it's a, immutable part of our lives, and what do we do with it? And it's been helpful for me to feel less isolated, and also like gratified in a certain way because of what it would have meant to Paul and what it means to Paul's legacy. It's the worst, but it's even being here today with you, right?
Yeah.
It's like I get to look in your eyes and talk about Paul, and it helps me personally too.
Yeah, in fact, before we started, I was telling Lucy that, for all of us, people who might be strangers to her, but who've read the book, in some way, she feels like part of the family, because you've, very courageously shared some of the experiences and incidents in this book. They really move you and touch you at a very, very deep level. So, in terms of this format of question and answers or interview, what we thought would work best is, we're going to try and let Paul speak through most of this interview. So we'll try and channel that. I've selected some quotes, and maybe if you could help me read those quotes,
Sure.
and I'll follow up with a question.
Sure. Do you want me to read this one?
Yes.
I will say one other thing about what people talk to me or write to me about. So Paul started out the book by talking about a rocky patch in our marriage, actually.
Yes.
So now I know a lot about other people's marriages, and the big secret of being a grown-up is people die and marriage is hard. Anyway, that's kind of good. He didn't spare anybody in the book, including himself or me or whatever, but that's part of it, right? It's intimate and authentic.
Hilarious.
So this part here.
Yes.
So
yes,
this part is, I'll just give a quick context. It's from the epilogue to the book, which I wrote after Paul died, that tells how Paul died and then reflects on him and what's been happening since he died. And it mentions this best friend of Paul's, which is Robin Maroney, who's the Google dude. Paul found poetry more comforting than scripture, and his ability to forge from his life a cogent, powerful tale of living with death. When Paul emailed his best friend in May 2013 to inform him that he had terminal cancer, he wrote, "The good news is, I've already outlived 2 Brontes, Keats, and Stephen Crane. The bad news is, I haven't written anything."
Yeah, the reason I sort of thought we'll start with this is, in reading this book, it's clear that Paul had the unusual and remarkable knack of making sense out of, the somewhat messy intersection of what some would call philosophy, science, religion, spirituality, and scripture. Can you talk to us a little bit about, Paul's beliefs, faith, and, what kind of perspective helped him make sense of everything put together?
Yeah, sure. And by the way, going back to that quote, the good news is I've already outlived 2 Brontes. The bad news is I haven't written anything.
Yes.
It actually gets at this really deep thing. Partly that Paul was funny. It's a funny way, in a way, to tell your best friend you have cancer, but it's also getting at his deep ambition in general and the fact of what writing meant to him, because he's writing this as a neurosurgeon, but the big loss in his mind immediately is his medical career plus his love for writing. So Paul, as a child, as he said in that video, had always thought he'd be a writer, was a real lover of literature, and thought he majored in English and then went on to study history and philosophy of science and medicine, and then surprised himself by becoming a doctor. His dad was a doctor who worked really hard, and initially Paul said, I don't want to work in that way, and thought he would enter the humanities, and then ultimately had this realization that meant a lot to him, which was many of the critical, life-changing moments we all face happen in a medical context. And that's good news and bad news, everything from having a baby to having a serious illness or a trauma. And he's sort of seeking what are the underpinnings of meaning in our lives from all these various ways. And I'll just give an example. When Paul was becoming more and more ill and having unexplained symptoms when he was 36, he started losing weight, he started having terrible back pain, and then night sweats and chest pain and a cough, and had been working with his doctor to figure out why. And then he got a chest x-ray that had nodules on it. And maybe it was tuberculosis, and most likely it was metastatic cancer, and both of us knew that. And we were on our way to Stanford Hospital because he was admitted to the hospital for expedited workup of that, what's causing these symptoms and the x-ray problem. And he packed 3 books, actually, to take with him to the hospital. And I was packing all the junk, like fuzzy socks and a health insurance card and whatever, and he's got this stack of books that he's carrying with him. And the books were Mere Christianity by C.S. Lewis, and a novel by Solzhenitsyn, Cancer Ward, and Being in Time by Heidegger, which is I don't know how you concentrate on that book when you're feeling well, let alone when you're feeling sick. But it was this stack of literature and religion and philosophy, and they were sort of like a little amulet. Like, I'm not taking a medical text, I'm taking literature and books. And so I think, like if you think about literature or science or philosophy, they're all sort of aiming at this question of who are we as humans? What are we doing here? What do our lives mean? And I think he sort of understood that all of those are a path to answering these bigger questions that are not just technical, but sort of rich and in many ways unanswerable. So I think sort of, I guess maybe that's what I would say about that. And also I think Paul had been interested in this question of human suffering and wrapping his head around mortality and suffering. So I think when he himself became ill, being a physician and being a reader, he had a language to talk about it, right? I mean, reading deepens our empathy. That's part of why we read, is to experience lives that are not our own. So he was able to sort of fall back on those tools when he became sick. And I think he says this lovely thing in his writing where he says, I didn't ask why me. The answer to the question would have been, well, why not me? And I think he sort of had that approach to thinking about suffering, and it helped him when he became ill. And some of that came from practicing medicine, and some came from literature.
In fact, in the book, there's this passage where he describes first seeing the CT scans, you guys. And actually, my next question is around that. And Lucy, if I could ask you to read that for us.
Sure. So this is from the prologue to the book. Lying next to Lucy in the hospital bed, both of us crying, the CT scan images still glowing on the computer screen, that identity as a physician, my identity, no longer mattered. With the cancer having invaded multiple organ systems, the diagnosis was clear. The room was quiet. Lucy told me she loved me. I don't want to die, I said. I told her to remarry, that I couldn't bear the thought of her being alone. I told her we should refinance the mortgage immediately.
So he gets this devastating news and begins talking to you about securing your future, refinancing the mortgage. What was it about Paul that kept him so action-oriented, so ambitious, as you said, and this recurring theme of striving that comes across so many times in the book? I wonder if you could elaborate on that.
Sure, yeah. And it's kind of interesting. So literally one of the first things he said was, I want you to remarry. And often you think about with cancer, like, or even like what kept him so action-oriented, like the obvious action when you have a diagnosis like this is like, we'll feed it, we'll beat it, we'll fight it, we'll find the best doctor, we'll beat this. And in a way, like that sentence of I want you to remarry is an immediate recognition of I likely will not survive this. And both of us knew that. And so part of Paul's striving during that time was he faced what was actually happening to his body. He understood the fact that his identity and his career trajectory, like 20 years as a neurosurgeon, neuroscientist, or 30 years, maybe write a book, like all of that just shattered. And so in this moment and henceforth, striving was like reshaping a new identity, which initially was going back to work as a neurosurgeon, and then frankly, when Breath Becomes Air became the reshaping of his identity and the ultimate purpose of his life, and was sustaining, even as his body was collapsing and he became more isolated and was at home and frail. The writing was sort of a way to continue to stay connected to others and to feel like he had a future even if he wouldn't be alive. It was this really interesting, and having a child actually meant some of the same things. And one of Paul's friends said recently, I think that Paul felt the struggle to find meaning in our lives is the meaning in our lives. And so it's like the fact of striving was extremely meaningful to him. And I'm supposed to teach our daughter about that, which is something we all teach our kids, right? It's like, it's important to strive, to do your best and to be a good person. And like, you can't do it all the time, but it's important.
And what really touched me in reading that was, on the one hand, here he is very pragmatic, recognizing the vulnerability of himself. And at the same time, he's not giving up either. I mean, there's this huge sense of, just going on and despite all the hard
Right, until you die, you're alive, right?
Yeah, and he wrote, years ago, and maybe, we could just pick up that thread.
Shall we read this part?
Yes, please.
Years ago, it had occurred to me that Darwin and Nietzsche agreed on one thing: the defining characteristic of the organism is striving. And then this next part skips around, and this is about coping through reading. I began reading literature again. Solzhenitsyn's Cancer Ward, B.S. Johnson's The Unfortunates, Tolstoy's Ivan Ilyich, Nagel's Mind and Cosmos, Woolf, Kafka, Montaigne, Frost, Greville, memoirs of cancer patients, anything by anyone who had ever written about mortality. I remember the moment when my overwhelming unease yielded. When that seemingly impassable sea of uncertainty parted, I woke up in pain, facing another day. No project beyond breakfast seemed tenable. I can't go on, I thought. And immediately its antiphone responded, completing Samuel Beckett's 7 words, words I had learned long ago as an undergraduate. I'll go on. I got out of bed and took a step forward, repeating the phrase over and over. I can't go on, I will go on.
So this is the exact opposite of just giving up. It's being very realistic and yet very, very powerful. And striving and progress, I think, has been a constant theme in reading the book. And there's a video that I watched where he says that just as the clock logs on hours, as the clock of our lives logs on more hours, there should be a measurable increase in some sort of progress. Can you maybe talk about that idea and how that drove how he did things?
Yeah, I guess maybe I'll reflect on what Paul was writing about and talking about. Mm-hmm. He said this interesting thing in an interview, because he wrote some of that I just read ended up in a New York Times little essay that he wrote. That was super serendipitous, that it even ended up in the New York Times, and then that led to his securing a book deal and writing this book.
And there was a story about how it actually got into the...
Oh, yeah.
Do you want
me to just tell that really quick?
Sure.
And then I'll go back to the time thing. So Paul was on an airplane after having returned to work as a neurosurgery resident for about a year while he was healthy enough to do that. And he wrote an essay that ultimately ended up being entitled, How Long Have I Got Left? And it was about how even when you know you're dying, the uncertainty about how much time you have left or how it will happen itself is its own type of pain. Uncertainty is just hard to tolerate in general, I think, and everybody can relate to that. So he wrote an essay about that, and he sent it to 2 people, a family member and then Robin Maroney, the Google guy who's a writer. And Robin wrote back and said, you buried your lead, and you're funnier than this essay is, and you're kind of making 3 different points, and I don't know. And the family member wrote back and said, I forwarded this directly to the op-ed desk at the New York Times. I hope that's okay. And it's crazy because then it was published, which Paul was exceedingly excited about, started getting emails from patients and doctors and felt really good about that. And got a literary agent in the process who has since told me one path to being able to write a book is to get a shorter essay published somewhere and demonstrate a response to it. And that's FYI if anybody here is trying to write a book. And so Robin Maroney can eat his words. And what was I going to say about that? That's the story. Yeah. So I can't remember the link back to the time thing, but I'll just say briefly about time. Paul said time used to have this linear progression feel to it. And now, while dying, time feels more like a space. And that's really interesting, and I think I've talked to a number of people about the experiences of aging and dying, and I've had older or elderly people relate to that sense of the change of time. Less linear, more like a space. And goals change over time, right? So we all think, and I think about my life projected like literally over decades, and there's a lot of sort of future-oriented thinking. And then that changes as you get closer to the end of your life. And in a way, it's not better or worse, it's just a shift. And I was just listening to this podcast with Paul as I was driving over, because if I'm going to talk about Paul, sometimes I'm like, oh, I want to hear his voice, or if I just miss him, I want to hear his voice. And he was talking about how he was at his 15-year Stanford reunion. He graduated from Stanford in '99 and just had the reunion the year before he died. And somebody said, like, oh, it's going to be fun to be at the 30th and see how everybody's doing. And Paul was like, it'd probably be kind of rude to say, like, well, I probably won't see you at the 30th. And he was asked, like, isn't that strange and painful to think you're not going to be at the 30th reunion? And he said, well, at certain times I just sort of conceive of it as like a fact of life. It's not any more painful than if someone said, well, I'll see you at the 150th reunion. And like any of us here would be like, well, no, you won't. Like it's not distressing in the same way, right? It's more like if you've conceptualized that it's unfair that you wouldn't be at the 30th or the 150th. So yeah, and I think that tendency about thinking about time is just really the difference between, how are you conceiving of your future and what actions are you taking now that lead to a future versus are focused more on the present. And one little side bit about that is there's all this research about mindfulness meditation or mindfulness, and I don't know if like Google gives you guys courses on mindfulness and stuff, but it's like it's helped me cope a lot actually, and one of the things is sort of like being this sort of frame of acceptance or non-judgment, and some of it is about being in the moment, focusing on the present moment, and there's all this research about how that's good for you. And I think when you're terminally ill or when you know your loved one will die, you are focused more on the moment. And even for us having a child, we decided to have a child after Paul got sick, and then she died when he was 8 months old. And I think even when you have a young infant, oftentimes you're wishing away time. Like, I wish she would sleep through the night. I wish this period of infancy were over. I can't wait till she's 5 or 10 or 20. And I think given that Paul's life expectancy was so short, the experience of having an infant and like those moments were actually really wonderful. So now I think a lot more about the future and the present, or the ways of conceiving about time. And it's sort of like takes some of the pressure off in a good way, or like reframes what I think life or illness means,
I was also asking you that when you sign books, you write Shanti, Shanti, Shanti. Can you share with us, what inspires that?
Yeah, so after Paul died, and I was like, I told Random House, I'll do a book tour, I'll do whatever you tell me to do. And I didn't know if I would like doing it, but I was like, I'm gonna like promote the book and keep this promise to Paul. And then they told me, and I did end up liking doing it for him. And then they told me I was gonna sign books. And I was like, I'm gonna sign the books, and then they said, think of an inscription, like apparently Oprah writes blessings, Oprah. And one of Paul's friends was like, well, you should just write blessings, Oprah. I was like, okay, I should think of my own thing. And so then I sort of had this brainwave and decided to write Shanti, 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 which is the last line of the poem, The Wasteland, which I literally bought the Cliff Notes for after Paul died, because it's hard. I wanted to sort of like dig into that poem. It's pretty obscure in some places. It's about life and death, and it's kind of funny at times. But the last line is Shanti, 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 and T.S. Eliot writes it with no punctuation and just sort of leaves it as a send-off. It just sort of hangs there at the end. And Shanti is a Sanskrit word that means, essentially means peace. Like at the end of yoga classes, people say Om Shanti, and it's that word. And T.S. Eliot transliterates it and spells it S-H-A-N-T-I-H, which is sort of a weird spelling. Oftentimes it's transliterated T-H-I or T-I. And he himself sort of translated it to mean the peace that passeth all understanding, which is actually a Bible verse. So he's sort of like, sort of like this interfaith version when Eliot translates it. And I sort of think of it as like a blessing and a send-off, and then a literary reference in honor of Paul, and almost like a little description, because Paul inspired me sort of with his calm or with his peace despite great suffering. And he wasn't a perfect dude. He was also like a normal person and funny and complicated, but he was brave. And so that's sort of, it's like a secret message to him, and then kind of a blessing to the person that I'm signing the book for. So that's what it's the end of that poem, The Wasteland.
Thank you. Thanks for sharing. There was this part going through illness where Paul describes how it's a process and not a one-time event, unlike death. And there's a lot of decisions that came along the way. Having a child was one of them. But before we get to that, there was this part about him being able to continue his practice as a doctor versus not. And I was wondering whether you could share how you guys thought about that as this was going on. And there's like a couple of lines that I've selected from that part of the. Yeah, thanks.
This one?
Yes.
Yeah. Graduation from residency required two things. And this is after he gets sick and he goes back to work. Meeting a set of national and local requirements, which I'd already done, and the blessing of the faculty. And then briefly in between here, he talks about how he runs into a fellow resident or young faculty who says, they may not actually graduate you. And he says, what? I don't mean to sound cocky, but I'm a good surgeon, just as good as, I know. I think they probably just want to see you performing the full load of a chief. It's because they like you, seriously. I realized it was true. For the past few months, I'd been acting merely as a surgical technician. I'd been using cancer as an excuse not to take full responsibility for my patients. On the other hand, it was a good excuse, damn it. But now I started coming in earlier, staying later, fully caring for the patients again, adding another 4 hours to a 12-hour day. It's pretty rigorous, right? You're like, Stanford, cut him a break. But then this is the important thing about being a doctor is it's not just a technical job, right? It's a connecting with those patients and, taking full responsibility for every aspect of their well-being.
Despite what you were going through yourself.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of the tensions about being a doctor. It's like the best and worst part, because it's stress on you too, emotionally and physically. But that's what he's talking about. Honestly.
Did you think that was like helpful for him in a certain way, even though it was taxing on him physically, as he mentions in the book?
Yes, for sure. He kind of surprised me by going back to work. It didn't surprise me because I knew his personality, but I think a lot of people, if you were given like months to a few years to live, and maybe the outside possibility of a decade, many people would quit their jobs. And I certainly would not fault somebody for doing that. I might do that. And but he really wanted to go back to work, and initially didn't think he could, and then did. And it sort of, it was very important to his identity. It was what he'd been training for. It was a very considered decision to leave the humanities and enter medicine and then neurosurgery. And so initially he got that, or always, he got this really deep meaning from taking care of patients. Later, writing the manuscript for When Breath Becomes Air was another way to feel like an expert, or to feel like he was helping people, or even healing people, in a completely different way. So that ended up being the case later. But I did a book reading recently, and one of the questions from the audience was, Paul, when he went back to work as a surgeon, was having really excruciating back pain, and he felt dizzy in the operating room at one point, and there were all these safeguards to keep his patients safe, and that was obviously the first priority, was that he could sufficiently act as a doctor, even though he himself was ill. But somebody said, do you think he put more wear and tear on his body? Do you think he died sooner because he went back to work and was not sleeping as much, or working so hard? And I was like, well, I can't think of a mechanism by which working as a neurosurgeon would make your chemo drug fail. So I don't really think so. And I was sort of like, whoa, that's a ballsy question to ask me, to my face. But, but at the same time, it was a really good question, actually. And I was reflecting on it, and I was like, well, I wonder, and if I think Paul could have even chosen, I think it gets to this question of the quality of your life versus the quantity of your life. And I think, especially when you're ill, it's fair and brave and good to also think about the quality of your life. And so I think about this, him taking on that burden was actually him taking on meaning and identity, and something that he really wanted was to keep being a physician, despite his illness, and it ended up working for a while. So I think it added deeply to the quality of his life during that time that he could still work.
I think you've also referred to this in talking about life support and being on the ventilator. The duration is not necessarily, synonymous with quality of how much time you have.
Yeah, right. And there's like that narrative of the battle, right? Like beat it, fight it, live every millisecond that you could. But there's a set of trade-offs, especially as treatments get harder to stand or less likely to work. And so at the very end of Paul's life, as you know, and I wrote about it in the epilogue to the book, he became very ill very fast and came up against the decision about whether to be put on a ventilator, on a breathing machine, and chose not to be. And it was, he had knowledge as a physician that it would likely extend maybe the duration of his life by hours to days. But if he couldn't interact or go home or write or hold our child or ever come off that breathing machine, which was most likely, then it wasn't for him. So he decided not to do it, and instead, our baby came into the hospital room, and the gears totally shifted completely to quality and not quantity. And it was, I only remember that day or those hours like almost as a series of images, like snapshots in my mind, because it was so painful and so intense to know that that was the last day of his life, and to be holding him in the bed and knowing like he's right here. And then he went to sleep, and then he died a few hours later, and it's like he's right here. And then he's like literally about to disappear. Like it was so intense, and that decision making was so hard and painful and even confusing, you know, like to weigh the trade-offs. But I think that's one of our great challenges in medicine, is to be able to help people, or within our families be able to weigh the trade-offs, because it's not as simple as like always throw all technology at the issue. It's like what makes sense to you as a person. And I think he made a really brave choice, and I think it was the right choice for him, but it's really hard, like in the moment, to know and to make choices like that.
I think by sharing it, I mean, you guys have done a great service to a lot of other people who are in similar situations, and you know, they feel that, you know, oh, there's a sense of empathy coming towards us because there's other people who are going through the same. And in fact, you know, Paul in the book shared a very personal decision, which you referred to, you know, deciding to have a baby. And I was wondering if you could, you know, share with the audience a little bit about how you guys thought about it, because I think it's a beautiful line that he writes where.
Yeah. I'll wait to, can I just like answer part of the question first?
Please.
So this was obviously one of the other hardest decisions. We had always thought that we would have a child toward the end of Paul's residency training, which would have been that same year, or like, you know, try to have a child, you can never predict. And we'd also been going through this rough patch in our marriage that I mentioned and he mentioned. And then he was diagnosed with cancer, and everything sort of came to a head. And then we started talking about how are we going to cope with this, and would we ever consider having a child still, which was a kind of a crazy decision, and in some ways. And both of us knew that he would likely die during the child's infancy or young childhood, which is a big challenge for me and a big challenge for our family and for him and for our daughter, who ended up being born in 2014. And we, each of us was worried about the other one. And I'll just read the part about this conversation. So, what are you most afraid of or sad about? Lucy asked me one night as we were lying in bed. Leaving you, I told her. I knew a child would bring joy to the whole family, and I couldn't bear to picture Lucy husbandless and childless after I died. But I was adamant that the decision ultimately be hers. She would likely have to raise the child on her own, after all, and care for both of us as my illness progressed. Will having a newborn distract from the time we have together? She asked. Don't you think saying goodbye to your child will make your death more painful? Wouldn't it be great if it did? I said. And I love it. I think, wouldn't it be great if it did, I think, is recognizing that like joy and suffering, both of those would be greatly deepened by the experience of having a child and then needing to leave that child. But sort of accepting both of those as a rich part of life is what he's getting at. And so she just turned 2. Her name's Katie. She's doing very well. We have this huge supportive family. And it's on me, I think, to help her understand where she came from and help shape the narrative of her life going forward. And she's really thriving, and I'm so happy we had that child. And I remember at the time, I was worried about inviting additional uncertainty and pain. Like nobody has a child because it's going to be easy. You have it, hopefully because it's going to be meaningful and you feel ready to do that. And so I sort of had to picture how does that fit into our lives now. And I read a book at that time called Far From the Tree by Andrew Solomon. I don't know if anybody has read that book. It's amazing. It's long and dense, but Andrew Solomon, the writer, is, this is going off on a tangent a little bit. Is that okay?
Yeah, of course.
It's
about parents and kids. And
it's about parents and kids. And Andrew Solomon is gay and dyslexic. And his mother was extremely supportive with his learning disability and less accepting of his being gay. And he writes, it led him to conceive of this idea of horizontal and vertical identities and the way in which your identity can be shaped by your family, or the way in which you have identities that you need to seek connection and support outside your family. And so he writes these various chapters on autism, different types of disability, children who are born out of rape, children who are criminals. He interviews Dylan Klebold's mom. And it's really intense, and it's all these versions of strife within a family and challenges for parents and children. And the parents, almost to a person, say, I would give anything to spare my child suffering, but the degree of resilience and meaning that this has brought me and my ability to cope and my child's ability to thrive in our family is very clear to me. And it talks about how the love families have for each other and the sense of meaning that people can get despite struggle is really deep. And so it sort of helped me understand both the sort of profound goodness of having a child, and also the degree to which struggle that comes from that is okay and is part of life. And even when it's extreme, families often are able to cope. So it sort of bolstered my ability to think about doing that. And then I was really scared of postpartum depression. My sister had really bad postpartum depression twice. She's a blogger and has shared that publicly. And so we strategized a lot about any way to help prevent that, because that would have been like an emotional separation from Paul, which would have
you had a ticking clock. And
it's like if Paul lives for 8 months and I'm depressed for 3 months, and I thought that would be really painful, because depression is like emotional isolation from other people, and my ability to take care of him and connect with him if that was compromised. So anyway, it was spooky, but I'm really glad we did it. And yeah.
Thanks. In fact, I'm going to jump around a little bit myself as well, because, you wrote a brilliant op-ed in New York Times entitled "My Marriage Did Not End When I Became a Widow." And you also described that, grieving, did not signal, it wasn't a static phase beginning or ending. It's just part of, it's one phase of an ongoing, could you maybe speak to that a little bit?
Sure.
Yeah.
And you're talking about this last part. Yeah. So, and just to say, grief was so hard for me. I obviously, I'm sure anybody in this room can relate to if you've lost a loved one close to you. And I developed horrendous tingling in my hands that for a while I had catastrophic thoughts about, and was convinced I had a disabling nerve disorder and couldn't take care of Katie. It was very, it turned out that was a physical symptom of grief. And I was like, wouldn't this be great if it were a physical symptom of grief? But I have a disabling nerve disorder the year that Paul died, which turned out not to be true. It just lifted. But Paul writes about how his own mom had seizures after her father died. I mean, it's just it's immense. And so, it's the easiest times for me are often situations like this, where I'm able to speak and connect with people. And the hardest times are after 7 p.m. when Katie goes to bed and I'm home alone. It's been very hard. But I wrote this essay that ended up in the New York Times by the grace of Random House, because Random House has a whole machine about once you have a book with them. So the essay's called "My Marriage Didn't End When I Became a Widow," and it's about the idea of feeling like a relationship continues, or your love for somebody continues even after they die. And it's based somewhat on a piece of writing by C.S. Lewis in the book A Grief Observed, where he says, bereavement is not the truncation of married love, it's one of its regular phases, like the honeymoon. What we want is to live our marriage well and faithfully through that phase too. And it really made sense to me. It's like even promoting the book for Paul, or making a memorial service, or raising our daughter. Like, it's all, Paul is still like a thread in our lives, obviously, and I still feel obligated to Paul, and to sort of serve Paul's legacy too. So I wrote about that, and this is describing, this is right at the beginning of that piece, where it's describing visiting Paul's grave. When my husband died from cancer last March at age 37, I was so grief-stricken I could barely sleep. One afternoon, I visited his grave in a field high in the Santa Cruz Mountains overlooking the Pacific Ocean, and lay on top of it. I slept more soundly than I had in weeks. It wasn't the vista that calmed my restless body, it was Paul just there under the earth. His body was so easy to conjure, limbs that had linked with mine at night, soft hands that I had grasped during the birth of our daughter, eyes that had remained piercing even as cancer thinned his face. And yet he was impossible to hold. I lay on the grass instead, my cheek against the ground.
Thanks. So I actually, while you were speaking, realized that we kind of lost track of time as well, but we still have a few minutes, and I want to open this conversation up to include the audience if you have any questions.
We have a daughter who, her dad is Paul, but she doesn't have any of her own memory of Paul. So how will I help shape her knowledge of Paul or memory of Paul? So in a way, the book, When Breath Becomes Air, is a letter to her. People ask me whether Paul wrote her letters or left particular writing specifically to her, and he didn't. He was conceiving of the book the whole way through as a way to communicate with her, and one of his greatest stresses was not to be able to complete it, or not to be able to leave behind for her the manuscript to read. And the last paragraph of the book is a love letter to her. And it's like my prized possession, and I have it memorized even though I didn't even try, and it's that's a key message to her. And then I think, there's this whole network of people who knew Paul and loved Paul, especially his brothers and our sisters-in-law, and friends and family and pictures, and so I think all of that sort of exists to help her understand who he was. At whatever point it is meaningful to her to discover that. I think in a way the most painful thing for me might be if she's like not interested in learning about Paul, which maybe would be true at various times in her life and different at other times. And so in a way it's sort of up to her, but I want to help her understand where she came from too. She's not in any type of pain from having lost Paul. But later she'll be in a different type of pain, right? Because she doesn't have a memory. And her cousin, Eve, who's Paul's brother's daughter, is the oldest cousin and just started kindergarten. And she may remember Paul, or at least have some images of Paul. And we have like this great photo of them drinking a mango lassi with 2 straws. And I wonder whether Katie will see those pictures and feel envious if Eve even has a small memory of Paul. Or if Eve, her older cousin, when she's like buying alcohol for underage Katie, will also be telling her about Paul. So I think that relationship with her family is going to be important too. I keep saying stuff like the word ballsy. That makes me be like, oh, this is going to go on YouTube. I'm a doctor. But I think it's okay.
Cool. Yes.
It's pretty simple. I practice mindfulness meditation for like a short period of time each day. And I used to be like, I'm not good at mindfulness. I keep figuring out I'm not thinking about my breath or whatever, and having to redirect my attention to the path of my breath. But I think like there's no such thing as being good at it or not. It's like purely about noticing and then redirecting your mind. And I started doing it actually well before Paul became ill, when I had an episode of depression during my residency training that was relatively mild, but it's actually quite common during residency when physicians are new at their jobs and under stress and not sleeping very much, and so there's starting to be more recognition and support for that. But I had a therapist at the time who wrote down this thing on her whiteboard in her office. She wrote, pain plus non-acceptance of pain equals suffering. And at the time I was like, well, I don't accept this. This must not be. And then later I realized what she meant, which is like the fact of not accepting pain that you can't change does lead to increased suffering. And I think for me, mindfulness has been helpful for that. And I have a lot of friends or colleagues or patients who love that app Headspace. I don't own stock in them or anything, but it's like there's an app on your phone and they help you track your progress with meditation, and they have these little short meditations you can listen to, and I know people have a lot of success with that. And obviously it's based in Buddhist practice, or which I don't really know anything about, but I think it has a lot. Those sort of little snippets of it have really resonated with me and helped me cope, and I think made me more resilient because I don't resist suffering that I can't change in the same way. But it's an ongoing sort of like daily process.
More?
Oh, do I plan to write more? Maybe. I don't know yet. I find writing to be a real struggle. I thought I would be more nervous to speak, but I actually am doing okay speaking and feel good doing that. I'm giving a talk at TED Med in December, which is like the first, or like one of the first talks that I have to deliver. And it's a different thing actually to figure out, rather than just talking about a personal experience, with some like side swipes at what the deeper thesis is, to think about like how to present a message and what kind of thing I want to actually be contributing to a conversation about, particularly healthcare. So I think that's kind of an exciting next step for me, is to think about that. And one thing that I'm really interested in is like getting back to that question of grappling with difficult decisions in medicine. How do we communicate with each other about what's actually happening, and how to weigh the trade-offs when we really wish we could beat an illness, but we may not be able to. So maybe I'll write about that. I don't know. It's kind of an exciting and strange time to have a role in medicine, or even in the public sphere. That's way different from what I ever thought I would have, and it's based on Paul's leadership in that way, to connect a personal experience to a bigger picture question. So I don't know, but thank you. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I'd love to. Yeah, so getting at that question of medical culture and how we have those conversations and balance quality and quantity of life. And I know Atul Gawande was here to speak in his book, Being Mortal, and his work since, testifying in front of the Senate and all these things, is all about how do we understand that people have other goals for their lives rather than just safety and quantity of life. And I think we have all this technology, and in medical culture and in medical school, you're often taught like we get to fix things and we get to use all these technological tools, and then the key is like the wisdom of how to do that. And I think we'll start incorporating a more ancient narrative too, with our modern tools. And then there are all these other, you're right, like doctors listen to doctors, so it's like good to be able to talk about that in medical schools and medical conferences and settings. And there are tools for doctors too, like Vital Talk, or Atul Gawande has a lab in Boston that puts out trainings for doctors. And then for patients and families, there are really good tools too, like I'm like blanking on the specific name of it. There's one called The Conversation Project, I think it's called, that's really good. And there are a number of different books, like The Conversation, by another doctor in Boston. And it's like, it's funny, those both have the word conversation in them, but I think that's one of the keys. Angelo Volandes, that's who wrote The Conversation.
Thanks.
Oh, how do I reconcile my love for Paul with having to move on? Yeah. I don't know the answer to that. I mean, I think part of it is that I didn't know that I would have all these positive feelings about Paul that would stretch forward, like loving him or feeling proud of him. I think I thought I would like just feel devastated and lonely and deflated. And instead it's like, I feel this other way. I still feel good about Paul. And then I think, I think the idea of like moving on or moving past, I think like that idea of like living with something, it makes sense to me too. I think like, I hope I remarry in the future, like Paul said, but I think I'll love Paul at the same time as well. And I actually just met somebody, you guys probably remember Brittany Menard, who was a young woman with a high-grade brain tumor who lived in California and then moved to Oregon to seek medical aid in dying if that became necessary for her, if her suffering and dying, if enough was enough. And she ended up dying after ingesting a medical aid in dying medication and becoming a big advocate for death with dignity. And her husband, Dan Diaz, has continued to speak and testify in front of state legislatures. And I met him the other day. Someone was like, you should meet this guy and talk about like grieving publicly and being propelled by your love for your late spouse. And I was like, that is sort of a weird singular experience. And so we like hit it off talking about that and like doing work on behalf of somebody who's not here. And so I think like you do just like continue to honor that person and then progress forward in your life and understand the ways in which they've influenced you. But, I think, and she said actually in this beautiful video about him remarrying, she's like, there's no part of me that doesn't want him to move forward and be a father, and these things that they couldn't have together. And I think it's like this beautiful, generous thing that you would say when you're losing somebody, or, Paul and Brittany, like, lost me and lost Dan, and like lost the future that they would have had with us. And so, it's like, I can't go on, I will go on.
Thank you so much once again, and thank you all
Thanks for having me.